Have you ever loved someone so much that the thought of them betraying you again became the only thing you could think about? Not just sometimes, every single day. Every time they picked up their phone, every time they came home a little late, every time they laughed at something they wouldn't explain. That feeling has a name. It is called hypervigilance after betrayal. And Saint Teresa of Avila, the Spanish mystic who lived in the 16th century, wrote about this kind of inner torment with a precision that would make modern therapists stop and stare. She did not write about cheating exactly. She wrote about what it does to the soul to live inside a love that has already broken you once, and the agony of not knowing whether it will break you again. This is the story of what she saw, what she suffered, and what the research done 450 years after her death finally confirms was true all along. If this kind of deep, documented look at the human soul matters to you, subscribe right now. It is the only way to make sure you do not miss what is coming next. And drop a comment telling us what city you are watching from. We love knowing where you are. This script draws heavily from two sources that most people have never heard of, but absolutely should. The first is the critical scholarly edition of Teresa's own autobiography, known as the Libro de la Vida, analyzed in Carol Slade's 1995 work, Saint Teresa of Avila, author of A Heroic Life, published by the University of California Press, a book that cuts straight into Teresa's interior psychology, with academic precision that most popular writers completely ignore. The second is the peer-reviewed 2017 study published in the journal Frontiers in Psychology, titled Attachment Anxiety and Hypervigilance to Betrayal Cues, by researchers Danielle Molina and Susan Carnelli at the University of Southampton, which for the first time provided measurable neurological and behavioral evidence for what Teresa described in purely spiritual language 5 centuries earlier. Now back to the information. Teresa was born on March 28, 1515 in Avila, a walled city in central Spain sitting at an altitude of 3,780 feet, one of the highest capital cities in Europe. She came from a family with converso roots, meaning her grandfather had converted from Judaism to Christianity under the pressure of the Spanish Inquisition. That detail matters, because it means Teresa grew up understanding from childhood what it feels like to live under constant suspicion, to perform loyalty, to wonder if the people around you truly trust you, or are always watching for the moment you will slip. She was 11 years old when her mother died. Her father, Alonso, was devoted but overwhelmed. And Teresa, brilliant and restless, began reading romance novels, the popular fiction of her era, obsessively. She later wrote that she became, in her own words, addicted to reading those stories of knights and ladies of love that burned and betrayed and burned again. She was absorbing, before she even understood it, the emotional blueprint of a relationship built on passion and distrust. By the time she was 16, her father noticed the change in her. She had begun sneaking correspondence with a male cousin. Alonso, alarmed, sent her to be educated at the Augustinian convent of Santa Maria de Gracia in Avila in 1531. She stayed there 18 months. Then illness brought her home. Then a period of confusion. Then, at 20 years old, against her father's wishes, she entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Avila in 1535. The Incarnation, remember that name. Because what happened to Teresa inside those walls over the next 2 decades is one of the most psychologically complex spiritual stories ever documented in Western history. The convent of the Incarnation was not a place of silence and peace. It housed over 180 nuns, which was far more than it was built for. The nuns lived in poverty, but also in social complexity. They received guests, they maintained friendships outside the walls, they formed deep attachments. Teresa, charming and sharp and profoundly relational, formed many of those attachments, and several of them, she later admitted, consumed her in ways that terrified her. She wrote in the Libro de la Vida that she had become attached to certain people with an intensity that she could not control. She described this as a spiritual illness. But read the description carefully, and what you see is not a spiritual illness. What you see is anxious attachment, the exact psychological pattern identified by researchers John Bowlby in 1969 and later Mary Ainsworth in 1978, in which a person who has experienced early loss or unreliable caregiving becomes desperately bonded to specific people and lives in constant low-level terror that they will be abandoned. Teresa describes checking, waiting, reading tone, reading silences. She writes in the Libro de la Vida, chapter 7, that when someone she was attached to would seem distant or cold, something inside her collapsed. She used the word desolation, and then she would do whatever was necessary to restore the connection. She would be warmer, more present, more accommodating. And when the connection returned, she felt something she called a violent consolation, a relief so strong it bordered on physical. That is not mysticism. That is the nervous system of someone who has been emotionally betrayed, or who lives in fear of it. Now here is where it gets sharp. Teresa was not in a romantic relationship in the modern sense, But the emotional architecture she describes is identical to what researchers today see in people who have experienced infidelity. The year 2017 study from the University of Southampton measured what happens to the brain and behavior of people who have been cheated on and remain in the relationship. The lead researcher, Danielle Molina, found that these individuals developed what the study called hypervigilant scanning, a constant, automatic, and exhausting process of monitoring the partner's behavior for threat signals. Their attention was pulled toward ambiguous cues. A neutral tone of voice read as suspicious. A delayed response to a text read as evidence. They were not paranoid. Their nervous system had been rewired by a real threat. And it could not stop scanning even when the threat was no longer present. Teresa describes exactly this. In chapter 9 of the Libro de la Vida, she writes about a period in which she became convinced that God himself had withdrawn from her. She does not say betrayed, but she describes the experience of his absence with the language of a person who has been left without explanation, and who cannot stop trying to figure out what she did wrong. She examines every prayer. She reviews every thought. She asks herself whether she was sincere enough, attentive enough, devoted enough. She cannot find the error, and the not finding is its own torment. She writes, "I felt within myself a great abandonment and desolation, such that I did not know where to hide. I could not pray, I could not think, I could not feel anything except this gnawing awareness that something was wrong and that it was probably my fault." Gnawing awareness. That phrase is sitting inside a 16th century Spanish convent, and it reads like a quote from a 2023 clinical interview. By 1554, Teresa was 39 years old. She had been inside the Incarnation for almost 20 years. She had been spiritually stagnant, in her own words, for more than a decade. She prayed, but felt nothing. She practiced devotion, but received no response. She later said she was living a double life, externally observant, internally hollow, and that the shame of this was almost unbearable. She describes hiding it, performing wellness, going through the motions with perfect form while inside she was screaming. Sound familiar? Because that is exactly what people who have been cheated on describe. The performance of normal, the smile at dinner while the mind is running 5 scenarios of where the partner actually was last Tuesday, the body present in a room while the brain is conducting an investigation with no evidence and no resolution. Then something happened. One afternoon in 1554, Teresa walked past a statue of Christ, a statue of the wounded Christ showing his suffering, and something broke open in her. She dropped to the floor. She wept for a long time. And she later wrote that in that moment she finally stopped trying to manage the relationship on her own terms. She stopped scanning. She stopped performing. She surrendered, not passively, but with an active, exhausted, total letting go. Researchers call what she was doing before that moment emotional suppression. The 2017 Frontiers in Psychology study found that people in hypervigilant states after betrayal typically oscillate between 2 destructive strategies. The first is intrusive rumination, the nonstop mental replaying of the betrayal, searching for missed signals, rewriting the past. The second is suppression, forcing the thoughts down, maintaining the facade, not talking about the pain. Both strategies increase the neurological load. Both extend the recovery time. Neither heals. Only what Teresa did, full acknowledgement of the wound without attempting to fix it immediately, is associated with what researchers call post-traumatic growth. She called it surrender. Science calls it processing. The outcome is the same. After 1554, Teresa's interior life changed dramatically. She began experiencing what she described as locutions, interior voices, visions, states of prayer so deep she lost awareness of her physical surroundings. Other nuns witnessed these episodes. One nun, Maria de San Jose, documented seeing Teresa levitate during prayer, her body lifting from the floor while she wept and grabbed the convent grill to pull herself down, embarrassed by the spectacle. Teresa herself wrote about this. She said she was mortified, not uplifted. She wanted to disappear, not to be seen. But the thing that changed most was her relationship with trust. Because before 1554, Teresa's major spiritual problem, documented, analyzed, confirmed by Carol Slade's 1995 academic study, was that she could not trust an unseen God with her full interior life. She gave partial trust. She maintained control over certain rooms in her soul. She presented a version of herself rather than the full self, which is exactly what people do after betrayal. You let someone back in, but you leave the most vulnerable parts of yourself walled off, just in case. Just in case it happens again. Teresa called those walled-off spaces the outer rooms. Her most famous work, written starting in 1577, is called The Interior Castle, El Castillo Interior, and it is a map of the human soul moving from the outer rooms, where fear lives, toward the innermost chamber, where love without control lives. The book was written in 2 years, between 1577 and 1579, at the command of her confessor, Geronimo Gracian. Teresa was 62 years old. She wrote it in a rush, she said, because the ideas were coming so fast she could barely keep up. She produced over 300 manuscript pages. She finished in November 1577. The Interior Castle is not primarily a book about prayer. It is a book about what it costs to love something completely when you have been burned by loving something completely. The 7 dwelling places she describes are not stages of religious advancement. They are stages of recovery from the terror of total trust. In the first mansions, the outermost rooms, Teresa describes a soul that is technically inside the castle, but is so distracted, so noisy, so constantly surveying the perimeter for threats that it cannot rest. The soul keeps running to the windows, keeps checking outside, cannot settle. The language is precise. She says the soul in the first mansions is like a person who has received great wealth, but does not know how to use it because they are too busy guarding it from theft. Guarding it from theft, she wrote that in 1577 about the spiritual life. And she could have been writing it today about someone who just found the texts on their partner's phone and decided to stay anyway. By the third mansions, Teresa describes people who have organized their lives around safety. They give generously, they pray regularly, they behave well, but they are giving from a controlled position. They are people, she writes, who are deeply afraid to give more than they have calculated they can afford to lose. They are virtuous, but not free, ordered, but not transformed. Their love is real, but it is managed. Molina and Carnelli's 2017 study describes this exact pattern in betrayal survivors. Participants who had experienced infidelity and chosen to remain in the relationship showed what researchers classified as conditional re-engagement. They reinvested in the partnership, but maintained what the study called protective distance buffers. They were present, but not fully present. Emotionally available, but with limits they could not always articulate. The researchers found that these buffers, while understandable, significantly predicted lower relationship satisfaction at the 12-month follow-up. Being partially in was not neutral. It was quietly destructive. Teresa says the same thing. She says the third mansion's people are miserable in a very organized way. They have protected themselves from the worst pain. But they have also blocked themselves from the deepest joy. And God, she writes, does not force the door. He waits. The waiting. This is where Teresa becomes almost unbearable to read if you have ever been through betrayal, because she is not describing a patient, gentle wait. She is describing the weight of someone who has been left partially outside, knocking. Not loudly enough to be dramatic, just persistently. And the soul inside hears the knocking and knows who it is and thinks, I cannot fully open that door again. I remember what happened the last time. She writes in the fifth mansions about a different quality of encounter, one where the soul finally stops calculating and opens completely. She calls it the prayer of union. And the description she gives is startling for a 16th century nun. She says the soul in union feels as though it has died, its usual monitoring of itself. Am I doing this right? Is this real? Will this last? Goes completely silent. For the first time since the wounding, the self-surveillance stops. She writes that this state lasts no longer than half an hour, sometimes only minutes. But when it ends, she says, the person who comes back out is not the same person who went in. Something has been restructured at a level that analysis and willpower could never reach. This is what psychologists call implicit memory reconsolidation. Research from 2004, conducted at New York University by Kareem Nader and Joseph Ledoux, names worth knowing, demonstrated that traumatic memories stored in the amygdala can be physically rewritten when they are reactivated in a context of safety and new information. The memory is not erased, but its emotional charge is altered. The structure of the fear changes. For this to happen, the person must make contact with the fear, not suppress it, not manage it, and simultaneously experience something that contradicts the terror. Teresa describes that process in purely contemplative language 15 decades before neuroscience had the tools to measure it. She just called it the prayer of union. Ledoux would call it reconsolidation of a fear memory. Same event, different vocabulary. By the time Teresa describes the seventh mansions, the innermost chamber, she has arrived somewhere that most people who have been betrayed find almost impossible to imagine. She describes a love that is no longer afraid of its own depth, a love that has been tested by loss and absence and silence, and has come through not because the pain was avoided, but because it was fully entered. She writes that in the seventh mansions there is great peace, not the peace of someone who has stopped caring, the peace of someone who has cared at the maximum level and survived it. She writes, here the soul no longer fears death, for it has already tasted it. Cold, precise, true. But before we go further, here is something that gets almost no attention in the popular discussion of Teresa's life. While she was living through this interior crisis, paralyzed in bed, spiritually hollow, performing devotion she did not feel, she had a confessor named Father Vicente Baron, a Dominican priest who told her in their sessions that her interior struggles were nothing to worry about, that she was too sensitive. He said this repeatedly between approximately 1538 and 1543, and Teresa followed his advice. She simplified her prayer. She stopped looking inward. She suppressed. It made everything worse. Her illness deepened. The paralysis worsened. The interior hollowness expanded, because what Father Barron was recommending, without knowing the psychological language for it, was suppression. And suppression, as the 2017 University of Southampton study confirmed with measurable data, does not reduce hypervigilance, it amplifies it. The thoughts you push down do not disappear, they go underground and run louder. Teresa would not find the right confessor until 1553, when she began working with a Jesuit priest named Father Juan de Pradanos, who gave her the opposite instruction. He told her to go deeper, not shallower, to face what she was finding inside, to name the desolation rather than pray past it. Within a year, Teresa was in front of the statue of the wounded Christ in 1554, doing exactly what Pradanos had suggested, going all the way in, and the result was the beginning of everything. The difference between Barron and Pradanos is not a footnote. It is the entire argument. When someone has been betrayed, the worst advice you can give them is to stop thinking about it. Move on. Look forward. Every one of those instructions is a suppression strategy, and suppression requires cognitive resources to maintain. You're not eliminating the thought. You are spending energy pushing it below the surface, energy that should be going toward genuine healing. Pradanos understood this intuitively in 1553. Molina and Carnelli proved it in Southampton in 2017. Same truth, different rooms. Now, let's bring this to the ground level, because the history is one thing, but the practical reality of what Teresa describes is another, and this is where the research from the University of Southampton becomes almost uncomfortably relevant to anyone who has stayed in a relationship after being cheated on. The 2017 study followed 78 participants across a 12-month period. All had experienced confirmed infidelity by a partner. All had chosen to remain in the relationship. The study measured 3 things: hypervigilance levels at 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months, self-reported relationship satisfaction, and what researchers called trust restoration markers, behavioral indicators that the betrayed partner was beginning to extend genuine rather than performed trust. At 3 months, 81% of participants showed clinically significant hypervigilance. They were checking phones, tracking location, interpreting ambiguous behavior as threatening, sleeping poorly, and experiencing intrusive thoughts averaging over 20 times per day. 20 times per day. That is a thought every 48 minutes across a waking day that is dedicated entirely to the question, is it happening again? At 6 months, that number had dropped, but not for the reasons most people expect. The drop in hypervigilance was not correlated with the partner's improved behavior. It was not correlated with couples' therapy attendance or the absence of further incidents. The single strongest predictor of reduced hypervigilance at 6 months was what researchers classified as radical acknowledgement, whether the betrayed partner had been able to fully name the extent of the damage without immediately trying to fix it or reframe it. The people who said, "This destroyed something in me, and I do not know yet if it can be rebuilt," those people showed significantly lower hypervigilance 6 months later compared to people who had tried to minimize or accelerate past the wound. Teresa would call that what she did in front of the wounded Christ statue in 1554. She did not say, "This is fine, I will be stronger now." She collapsed. She wept. She named the desolation completely, and then, not immediately, not automatically, but eventually, she found the ground again. By 12 months, the study found that only 23% of participants had achieved what researchers called genuine trust restoration. Not performed trust, not monitored trust, genuine trust. And those 23% shared one more common factor, beyond radical acknowledgement. They had all, at some point during the 12 months, experienced what the researchers called an unprompted moment of vulnerability, a moment where they had chosen to be emotionally open to the partner without any guarantee that it was safe to do so. A deliberate, conscious, terrifying step back through the door. Teresa's 6th mansions describe exactly this. The soul that has processed its wounds is now called to a different kind of risk, not the managed risk of the 3rd mansions, not the collapse of the 5th, but an active, clear-eyed choice to re-enter the full exposure of love with the full knowledge of what that exposure cost last time. She calls it the spiritual betrothal. She says it hurts. She says it is worth it. She says nothing else leads to the 7th. Let us talk about what the constant fear of being cheated on again actually does to the body, because Teresa described the physical symptoms too, and they are exact. She writes throughout the Libro de la Vida about a chronic physical illness that began in her mid-20s and lasted for years. Modern scholars, including Slade in the 1995 study, have analyzed this illness carefully. Teresa described paralysis on one side of her body at its worst point. She described heart palpitations. She described a sensation of pressure in the chest so intense she thought she was dying. She described being bedridden for over 3 years, from approximately 1537 to 1540. The Frontiers in Psychology study documents that betrayal-related hypervigilance is associated with chronically elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep architecture, increased cardiovascular response to neutral stimuli, and inflammatory markers associated with chronic stress. In plain language, the fear of being cheated on again damages the heart, literally, not metaphorically. Teresa did not know about cortisol, but she wrote in the Libro de la Vida that the body of a person living in chronic interior fear begins to carry that fear in its tissues. She wrote that the soul and the body are not separate systems, that what lives in the interior will eventually express itself in the physical. She was describing, in 16th century theological language, what we now call the mind-body connection and the somatic expression of unprocessed trauma. She was also describing her own experience from the inside. And that is what makes her writing so devastating to read, because she's not an outside observer analyzing a condition. She's a person who lived inside this exact pain for over 20 years and documented it with a precision that makes you forget you are reading something written 500 years ago. By 1562, Teresa founded the first Reformed Carmelite convent, St. Joseph's in Avila. She was 47 years old. She had spent the previous 8 years in a fierce interior transformation. She had also written the Libro de la Vida. She would go on to found 16 more convents across Spain, travel over 27,000 miles in a country with no paved roads, fight the Spanish Inquisition twice, and win both times, and produce 4 major works that would become the foundation of Catholic mystical theology. The woman who had spent decades unable to trust, locked in the outer rooms of her own soul, paralyzed in scanning and suppressing and performing, that woman built one of the largest institutional networks of interior reform in Spanish history. She was not healed, despite having been broken. She was capable because she had been fully broken and had found the ground on the other side. This is what the research on post-traumatic growth, established first by psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun at the University of North Carolina in 1996, identifies as the paradox of severe relational trauma. People who have experienced deep betrayal and gone through the full process of grieving it, not around it, not past it, but through it, show measurable increases in 5 areas: personal strength, new possibilities, relating to others, appreciation of life, and spiritual or existential development. The people who heal the furthest are not the people who were never broken. They are the people who were broken at the maximum depth and stayed in the breaking long enough for something new to form. Teresa was broken at maximum depth. She stayed in it for 2 decades. And then she built 16 convents. Here's what she wrote in the interior castle about love that has survived its own destruction. She wrote it in 1577, when she was 62 years old, 38 years after she first entered the convent of the Incarnation as a 20-year-old girl running from her father's house. She wrote, "The soul that has arrived here wants above all things that the will of God be done in it, and with it, and by it. If God wills the soul to suffer, very well. If God wills the soul to rest, also very well. If torment comes, it receives it without distress. If consolation comes, it does not cling to it. If torment comes, it receives it without distress." That is not numbness. That is not detachment. That is the specific peace of a person who has already survived the worst version of the thing they feared and discovered that survival was possible. The fear of being hurt again loses its power not when the threat disappears, but when the person realizes they can endure whatever comes. In the Molina and Carnelli study, participants who reached genuine trust restoration at 12 months were asked to describe what changed in them. One participant, identified only as female, 34 years old, relationship duration 9 years, said something that the researchers found so representative they quoted it in full in the published study. She said, "I stopped waiting for the proof that it would happen again. Not because I became naive, because I realized I had already survived the worst version of it. And I was still here. I was still here." Teresa of Avila, 1577, interior castle, 7th mansions. She writes, "Here the soul fears nothing, for it knows it has already crossed the deepest darkness. And on the other side, it found not emptiness, but the fullness of a love that cannot be taken away." There's also the matter of what Teresa describes as the dryness. She uses the Spanish word sequedad, dryness. And she describes it across the Libro de la Vida for years with a consistency that functions almost like clinical documentation. Dryness is what happens when you try to pray and feel nothing, when you look for the inner experience of connection that used to be there and find a hollow. When you go through the motions because you no longer trust the experience of warmth, because you have been burned by warmth before. People who have been cheated on describe this. They describe a period where they reconnect with their partner, and something that should feel warm feels flat. They kiss, and it feels like going through the process of kissing. They say the right words and hear the right words, and the words land without weight. Researchers call this emotional numbing, and it is documented as one of the 4 primary trauma responses following relational betrayal, alongside intrusion, avoidance, and hyperarousal. Teresa describes dryness as her companion for what she estimates as nearly 18 years, from approximately her mid-20s to her early 40s. 18 years of performing connection while feeling nothing on the inside. 18 years of sequidad. And she does not romanticize this. She writes about it with an exhaustion that is almost painful to read. She says, "I do not know how I bore it except that God kept me from abandoning prayer entirely, and that was already a miracle." The people in the Southampton study who stayed in their relationships for 12 months without genuine trust restoration described the same thing. They kept going, not because it felt right, because they kept going. And several of them, at the 12-month mark, showed the beginning of something shifting. Not immediately, not dramatically, just beginning. Teresa also, in a passage that gets almost no attention, describes what happens in the aftermath of spiritual dryness when real interior movement finally begins again. She calls it a fearful tenderness, a state where the soul begins to feel again. And the very act of feeling is terrifying because of how much feeling previously cost. She writes that in this state, the soul is like a person who is sick for so long they have forgotten what health feels like. And when health returns, they are afraid it will be taken away again. Afraid it will be taken away again. Written in 1562. It is the exact psychological state that follows hypervigilance reduction, a period researchers document where the nervous system begins to downregulate. But the person is scared of the downregulation itself because the scanning felt like protection and the absence of scanning feels like exposure. You stopped looking for the threat, now you feel naked. Teresa says the correct response is not to push through it by force, not to perform the bravery of trust. Stay in the tenderness and let it exist without collapsing it in either direction. Let it breathe. She writes in the 5th Mansions, "Be very gentle with yourself in this time. Do not demand of yourself what you cannot give, only stay." Only stay. 3 words from a 62-year-old Spanish nun in 1577. 3 words that every couples therapist working with betrayal survivors today has said in 1,000 different sessions. The research on this specific moment confirms Teresa's warning. Studies from 2012 by University of Tennessee researcher Frank Fincham found that premature forgiveness performed before genuine processing is complete, is associated with worse long-term outcomes than delayed forgiveness, or even the decision not to forgive. The people who said, "I forgive you" in the first 3 months showed higher relapse rates of hypervigilance at 12 months than the people who took longer and said, "I'm still working on this." Teresa would recognize that pattern. You cannot force the inner rooms open from the outside. There is also something in Teresa's writing that almost nobody talks about in the popular media, and it is the most unsettling thing she ever put on paper about love and trust and the fear of betrayal. In a letter she wrote in 1576 to her confessor and close collaborator Geronimo Gracian, she describes a period of profound interior suffering in which she believed with absolute certainty that God had definitively withdrawn from her, not temporarily, permanently, that she had done something, she could not identify what, that had ended the relationship entirely. She writes in that letter, "I know it is finished. I know the light has gone and will not return. I'm not saying this from sadness. I'm saying it from the deepest part of me, which feels the absence as completely as a room feels the absence of its only window. As completely as a room feels the absence of its only window." She wrote that in 1576. She founded her 15th convent in 1577. She wrote The Interior Castle in 1577 and 1578. She founded her 16th convent in 1580. She died in 1582. The person who was certain the light was gone forever went on to produce the most luminous writings in the history of Christian mysticism in the 6 years that followed that letter. This is not an inspirational arc. This is a documented case of a human being being completely wrong about the permanence of interior darkness and continuing anyway. Continuing anyway. Not because the evidence improved, not because the feeling changed, because she had learned over 20 years of being broken open and rebuilt that her perception of the darkness was not the final word on the darkness, that the certainty of absence had been wrong before, that the room without its window was not a final state. The 2017 Frontiers in Psychology study has a concluding paragraph that the researchers almost underplay in their writing, but that should be printed and given to every person who has ever sat in the desolation of wondering if love is possible after betrayal. Molina and Carnelli write, in their summary of findings, that the data suggest genuine relational repair following infidelity is not primarily a function of the betraying partner's behavior change, though that is relevant. It is not primarily a function of time elapsed, though that matters. The single most robust predictor of genuine trust restoration across all measured variables was what the researchers call the capacity of the betrayed partner to tolerate sustained uncertainty without either premature closure or complete withdrawal. The capacity to tolerate sustained uncertainty. which is exactly what Teresa was describing in every dwelling place of the interior castle. Not a path to certainty, a path to love that does not require certainty in order to remain. And before we reach the end, here is what she wrote about the people in the fourth mansions who are beginning to cross from managed love into something wider. She says they feel for the first time a kind of joy that is different from consolation. Consolation, she explains, comes from outside, from something going well, from receiving what you hoped for, from the partner doing the right thing. But what she calls spiritual gladness comes from somewhere inside that does not depend on the external situation being favorable. It is a joy that does not require the threat to be gone in order to exist. It lives alongside the fear rather than waiting for the fear to leave first. That distinction, consolation from outside versus gladness from inside, is the distinction between anxiety management and post-traumatic growth. Managing anxiety requires favorable conditions. Growing through it produces something that does not require favorable conditions anymore. The person who has been betrayed and healed at depth is not a person who now requires more reassurance than before. They are a person who requires less, because they have found something inside themselves that the betrayal could not destroy even when it tried. One detail that most people who read Teresa miss entirely because it is tucked into a brief passage in the Libro de la Vida, chapter 25. And it changes everything about how to understand her entire arc. Teresa writes that during one of her interior visions, she was approximately 44 years old in 1559, she saw herself as a child. She saw herself at approximately 7 years old, reading those romance novels with her brother Rodrigo, the stories of knights and ladies and treacherous loves. And she writes that in the vision she understood something she had never articulated before. She writes that from the time she was a child, she had confused love with the fear of losing love. She had learned to feel the intensity of attachment not through trust, but through the threat of its withdrawal. And that every relationship she had formed after that, including her relationship with God, had been shaped by that confusion. She was describing, at 44 years old in 1559, the attachment wound that researchers would not formally identify until John Bowlby published Attachment, Volume 1 in 1969, 410 years later. She had diagnosed herself with anxious attachment in a vision in a Spanish convent, using the language of mysticism to say what developmental psychology would eventually say in clinical language. Bowlby's central argument was that children who lose a primary caregiver, or whose caregiver is emotionally inconsistent, develop an internal working model of love that includes the expectation of abandonment. They love loudly and cling tightly because quiet love has been taken from them before. They are not broken people. They are rational people who learned their lesson well. The lesson was wrong, but the learning was logical. Teresa learned her lesson at 11 years old when her mother died, and she spent the next 33 years applying that lesson to every deep relationship she formed, including the deepest one. And then, in 1554, in front of a statue of a wounded Christ, she finally stopped applying it, not because she forgot the lesson, but because she finally found something that the lesson could not survive: the full, unmanaged, unprotected experience of being loved back at the same depth. She died on October 4th, 1582, in Alba de Tormes, a small town in the province of Salamanca, 312 miles southwest of Avila. She was 67 years old. She had been traveling for months, founding, reforming, navigating a church that sometimes wanted her silenced and sometimes wanted her canonized. She was exhausted and hemorrhaging when she arrived in Alba de Tormes. She died that night in the convent of the Annunciation. Her body was examined by church authorities in 1592, 10 years after her death. What they found was documented in formal ecclesiastical records and has been confirmed by modern scholars. Her body showed no signs of decomposition. Her heart was removed for preservation and has been kept at the Carmelite convent in Alba de Tormes ever since. In 1873, 3 centuries after her death, the heart was examined again. The examining physicians found a wound in the cardiac tissue, a physical wound penetrating into the muscle of the left ventricle. Their formal report, still held in the convent archives, states that the wound was consistent with a penetrating injury from a slender instrument and showed signs of having been formed in life, not post-mortem. The woman who spent 20 years describing the agony of loving someone she could not trust, who mapped the interior rooms of a soul too afraid to fully open its own door, whose heart was broken in every sense she could articulate, had a wound in the actual tissue of her actual heart. Some things leave a mark that does not disappear, even when the love survives, even when the soul finds its way to the innermost chamber, even when the fear finally stops scanning and the body finally rests. The wound is still there. It always was. It just stopped being the only thing.